Imagine yourself walking down the street, just minding your own business, until a sudden realization hits you. You think, wow, I am so lucky that I could see all these wonderful sceneries around me. I am so lucky that I could hear all these noises and voices that just surround me. I am so lucky to be able to taste all these different types of food and flavors and sensations. And I'm so lucky to be able to smell the scent of flowers, to smell the sea, to smell my dog. You know what I mean. Now, what you are thinking about is what we collectively call the special senses. And you missed one of them. Balance. So we have these 5 senses: sight, hearing, balance, smell, and taste. These 5 are called the special senses. But what exactly are special senses? What use do they have in our body? And how do they work? You're in luck because that is for us to tell you. Welcome to our channel. If you want to learn more about any other sciencey topics out there, make sure to click that subscribe button and that notification button. Yeah, that little bell over there for you to be part of the notification squad. And now, without further ado, let us start the video. Now, what are the special senses? In medicine and anatomy, the special senses are the senses that have specialized organs devoted to them. For example, you have your eyes for vision, the ears for hearing and balance, the nose for smell, and the tongue for taste. Now, in contrast to the small and widely distributed general receptors, the special sense receptors are either large, complex sensory organs or localized clusters of receptors. When we were younger, we were taught that there are 5 major senses of the human body: touch, sight, hearing, smell, and taste. But not all of these are special senses. That is because touch is actually a mixture of the general senses, and it falls under the topic of the nervous system. The other 4 traditional senses, including equilibrium, fall under a totally different category, the special senses. And we are going to talk about that in this video. First, we will be talking about the eye and vision. The world is beautiful. God created this vast piece of elemental chunk and filled it with wonders for us to see. Whenever we see the birds fly, or when cars swerve by, we owe that to our eyes. Well, that was poetic. Now, in order for us to truly understand how the eye works, we'd have to know first its anatomy. This is the eye. Beautiful, isn't it? It's what we stare at, and it's what we stare with. And it is what we call the windows of our soul. Now let's take a closer look at these magnificent organs. The adult eye is a sphere that measures about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters in diameter. Only the anterior 1/6 of the eye's surface can normally be seen. Here we have the anatomy of the external eye, and here are its parts. The eye possesses accessory structures which include the extrinsic eye muscles, the eyelids, the conjunctiva, and the lacrimal apparatus. The extrinsic eye muscles are the muscles that are responsible for the movement of your eyes. And there are 6 of them, namely the lateral rectus, which moves your eye laterally, the medial rectus, which moves your eye medially, the superior rectus, which elevates the eye and turns it laterally, the inferior rectus, which depresses the eye and turns it laterally, the inferior oblique, which elevates your eye and turns it medially, and the superior oblique, which depresses your eye and turns it medially. The extrinsic eye muscles are controlled by various cranial nerves, the abducens, oculomotor, and trochlear nerves to be exact. The eyelids are the 2 movable pieces of skin that cover your eye for protection, and they meet at the medial and lateral corners of the eye. The medial and lateral commissure or canthus, respectively. The space between the eyelids in an open eye is called the palpebral fissure. And then we have your eyelashes, which are the hairs that grow along the top of your eyelids. You also have modified sebaceous glands associated with the eyelids, and these are called the tarsal glands, which produce an oily secretion that lubricates the eye. On the other hand, you have also your ciliary glands, which are modified sweat glands that lie between the eyelashes. Its name is derived from the word cilium, which means eyelash. And then you have your conjunctiva, which is the mucous membrane that covers the front of the eye and lines the inside of the eyelids. You also have your lacrimal apparatus, which is the physiological system containing the orbital structures for tear production and drainage. The lacrimal gland is located within the orbit above the lateral end of the eye. It continually releases fluid which cleanses and protects the eye's surface as it lubricates and moistens it. These lacrimal secretions are commonly known as tears. As tears are produced, they flush across the eyeball into the lacrimal canaliculi medially, then into the lacrimal sac, and finally into the nasolacrimal duct, which empties into the nasal cavity. These lacrimal secretions do not only contain salt and water, for they also contain mucus, antibodies, and lysozyme, which is an enzyme that destroys bacteria. Let's move on to the internal structures of the eye. Eye, or what we commonly call the eyeball, is actually a hollow sphere, and it has walls with 3 layers, and it is filled with fluids called humors. The 3 layers forming the wall of the eyeball include the fibrous layer, the vascular layer, and the sensory layer. The fibrous layer is the outermost layer of the wall of the eye. It consists of the sclera, which is the dense fibrous opaque white outer coat enclosing the eyeball, or what we call the white of the eye, and the cornea, which is the clear outer covering of the eyeball that is packed with nerve endings. The vascular layer is the middle layer of the eyeball, and it has 3 regions. The choroid, which is a blood-rich nutritive tunic that contains a dark pigment. The ciliary body, to which the lens is attached by a suspensory ligament called the ciliary zonule, and then the iris, the opaque contractile diaphragm perforated by the pupil and forming the colored portion of the eye. Within the iris is a structure called the pupil, through which light passes. The third and the innermost layer is called the sensory layer. In this layer, we can find the 2-layered retina. The outer layer of the retina is called the pigmented layer, and it is composed of pigmented cells. The second layer is the transparent inner neural layer. This layer contains the photoreceptors called the rods and cones. Electrical signals pass from the photoreceptors via a 2-neuron chain, bipolar cells, and then ganglion cells before leaving the retina via the optic nerve. The result of this process is vision. The rods allow us to see in gray tones in dim light, and they provide our peripheral vision. On the other hand, cones are discriminatory receptors that allow us to see the details of our world in color under bright light conditions. We also have the so-called optic disc or blind spot, and this is the area where the optic nerve leaves the eyeball. When light from an object is focused on the optic disc, the object disappears from our view and we cannot see it. Lateral to each blind spot is the fovea centralis, a tiny pit that contains only cones. Consequently, this is the area of greatest visual acuity, or point of sharpest vision. And then we have the lens of your eyes. And no, not that type of lens. This type of lens. It is the clear part of the eye that focuses light to form clear images. The lens divides our eyes into 2 segments. The anterior or aqueous segment, which contains a clear watery fluid called the aqueous humor, and the posterior or vitreous segment, which is filled with a gel-like substance called either vitreous humor or the vitreous body. These fluids help maintain intraocular pressure, or the pressure inside the eye. The aqueous humor is reabsorbed into the venous blood through the scleral venous sinus, or canal of Schlemm. The ophthalmoscope is an instrument that illuminates the interior of the eyeball, allowing the retina, optic disc and internal blood vessels at the fundus or posterior wall of the eye to be viewed and examined. Now, how does vision work? Your eyes work much like a camera. Light bounces off the image in front of you and comes into your eyes through the cornea. The cornea will help direct the light towards your pupil and iris. These two parts work together to control the amount of light entering your eye. You may have noticed that sometimes your pupils are bigger and sometimes they are smaller. This is because an iris can shrink and grow, allowing different amounts of light to pass through your pupils. This is like controlling the aperture of a camera. Once the light comes through the pupil, it will go through the eye's lens. Just like in a camera, the lens is used to focus on an object and direct the light to the back of the eye. The back of the eye is called the retina, and it has special sensors called cones and rods. Visual information excites the cone and rod sensors, and they are involved in seeing color. The vision center is located in the back part of your brain, or the occipital cortex or lobe. It is responsible for decoding the electrical information coming from the retina. The vision center interprets the electric form of the image, allowing you to form a visual map. Accommodation is what you call the ability of the eye to focus specifically for close objects, particularly those less than 20 feet away. The image formed on the retina as a result of the light-bending activity of the lens is a real image. That is, it is reversed from left to right, upside down, and smaller than the object. Visual pathways. Impulses from the retina leave via the optic nerve, then cross over at the optic chiasma, then move to the optic tract, to the optic radiation, and finally to the visual cortex at the occipital lobe. Let's move on to our eye reflexes. First, we have convergence, which is the medial movement of the eye when we view close objects. When the eyes are suddenly exposed to bright light, the pupils immediately constrict. This is the photopupillary reflex. The pupils also constrict reflexively when we view close objects. This accommodation pupillary reflex provides for more acute vision. Always remember that whenever you see your crush or those gorgeous celebrities or well, yeah, that too. You'd have to thank your eye. And now's the time we would talk about the ears. Remember that jump scare? Now, you were not shocked just because you saw its scary face, but also because it is accompanied with that sound, which might have thrown you off balance. And that brings us to your next special sense. Music. I love music. All types of music. Who doesn't like music? And who doesn't hate noise? Well, there may be some. Now, the organs that are responsible for us to hear these sounds are the ears. Want to learn more about them? Then let's blast off! First, we're going to be talking about the ear's anatomy. Anatomically, the ear is divided into three major areas: the external or outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The external and middle ear structures are involved with hearing only. The internal ear functions in both equilibrium and hearing. The external or outer ear is composed of the auricle and the external acoustic meatus. The auricle or pinna is what most people call the ear, and it is the shell-shaped structure surrounding the auditory canal opening. The external acoustic meatus or auditory canal is a short, narrow chamber carved into the temporal bone of the skull, and its skin-lined walls are the ceruminous glands, which secrete waxy yellow cerumen or earwax, which provides a sticky trap for foreign human bodies and repels insects. Sound waves entering the auditory canal eventually hit the tympanic membrane or eardrum and cause it to vibrate. The canal ends at the eardrum, which separates the external from the middle ear. The middle ear or tympanic cavity is a small air-filled mucosa-lined cavity within the temporal bone. It is flanked laterally by the eardrum and medially by a bony wall with two openings, the oval window and the inferior membrane-covered round window. The pharyngotympanic tube or auditory tube runs obliquely downward to link the middle ear cavity with the throat. In the tympanic cavity, we can find the three smallest bones of the body, which are collectively called the ossicles. These bones, named for their shape, are the hammer or malleus, the anvil or incus, and the stirrup or stapes. Let's move on to the inner ear. The internal ear or inner ear is a maze of bony chambers called the bony or osseous labyrinth, located deep within the temporal bone behind the eye socket. The three subdivisions of the bony labyrinth are the spiraling pea-sized cochlea, the vestibule, and the semicircular canals. The bony labyrinth is filled with a plasma-like fluid called perilymph. Suspended in the perilymph is a membranous labyrinth, a system of membrane sacs that more or less follows the shape of the bony labyrinth. The membranous labyrinth itself contains a thicker fluid called endolymph. Now let's move on to the ear's physiology, starting with equilibrium. The equilibrium receptors of the inner ear, collectively called the vestibular apparatus, can be divided into two functional arms. One arm responsible for monitoring static equilibrium and the other involved with dynamic equilibrium. We are going to start with static equilibrium. Within the membrane sacs of the vestibule are receptors called maculae. These are essential to our sense of static equilibrium. They report on changes in the position of the head in space with respect to the pull of gravity when the body is not moving, hence static meaning at rest. Each macula is a patch of receptor cells with their hairs embedded in the otolithic membrane, a jelly-like mass studded with otoliths, tiny stones made of calcium salts. As the head moves, the otoliths roll in response to the changes in the pull of gravity. This movement creates a pull on the gel, which in turn slides like a greased plate over the hair cells, bending their hairs. This event activates the hair cells, which send impulses along the vestibular nerve to the cerebellum of the brain, informing it of the position of the head in space. Now let's graze over the dynamic equilibrium. The dynamic equilibrium receptors, found in the semicircular canals, respond to angular or rotatory movements of the head rather than to straight line movements. Within the ampulla, a swollen region at the base of each membranous semicircular canal is a receptor region called a crista ampullaris, or simply crista, which consists of a tuft of hair cells covered with a gelatinous cap called the cupula. When your head moves in an arc-like or angular direction, the endolymph in the canal lags behind. Then, as the cupula drags against the stationary endolymph, the cupula bends, like a swinging door with the body's movement. This stimulates the hair cells, and impulses are transmitted up the vestibular nerve to the cerebellum. Now let's move on to hearing. Ever heard your favorite singer hitting those unbelievable notes? Well, haven't you wondered how you're able to hear them? This is how the mechanism of hearing works. Sound waves enter the outer ear and travel through the external auditory canal until they reach the tympanic membrane, causing the membrane in the attached chain of auditory ossicles to vibrate. The motion of the stapes against the oval window sets up waves in the fluids of the cochlea, causing the basilar membrane to vibrate by the movements of the gel-like tectorial membrane. This stimulates the sensory cells of the organ of Corti atop the basilar membrane to send nerve impulses to the brain. Well, congratulations! You are now able to hear. Now, turn that stereo up.
And now we move on to the chemical senses. The receptors for taste and olfaction are classified as chemoreceptors because they respond to chemicals in solution.
Let us first tackle olfaction. The world of smell is a full spectrum. You have those wonderful fragrances on one side, and then those nasty pungent ones on the other. Nevertheless, we cannot deny the fact that olfaction has played a great role in our lives.
This is the mechanism of olfaction. The olfactory mucosa contains the olfactory receptor neurons that are responsible for scent transduction. The transduction occurs in the olfactory receptors located on cilia at the ends of the olfactory receptor neurons. Odorant molecules can reach the olfactory receptors via a passive pathway or an assisted pathway. Olfactory receptors are protein molecules attached to the olfactory receptor neurons. The attachment of scent molecules to the olfactory receptors creates a series of chemical reactions that result in an action potential in the cilia. The electrical signal is sent via the axons of the olfactory neurons to structures called glomeruli on the left and right olfactory bulbs, which are actually an outcropping of the brain. The part of your body which is responsible for your sense of taste is your tongue. The taste buds, or specific receptors for the sense of taste, are widely scattered in the oral cavity. The dorsal tongue surface is covered with small peg-like projections, or papillae. The taste buds are found on the sides of the large round valate or circumvallate papillae and on the tops of the more numerous fungiform papillae. The specific cells that respond to chemicals dissolved in the saliva are epithelial cells called gustatory cells. Their long microvilli, the gustatory hairs, protrude through the taste pore, and when they are stimulated, they depolarize and impulses are transmitted to the brain.
There are 5 basic taste sensations, each corresponding to stimulation on one of the 5 major types of taste buds. The sweet receptors respond to substances such as sugars, saccharin, some amino acids, and some lead salts. Sour receptors respond to hydrogen ions, or the acidity of the solution. Bitter receptors to alkaloids, and salty receptors to metal ions in solution. Umami, a taste discovered by the Japanese, is elicited by the amino acid glutamate, which appears to be responsible for the beef taste of steak and the flavor of monosodium glutamate, a food additive. And voila! You can now enjoy your Jollibee meal. That ends our video for Special Senses. We hope that you have learned a lot from this video. Next up, we will be talking about the endocrine system. Stay tuned.